I'd first heard about Salvia Divinorum in the fall of 2005. Ever since then, I've wanted to try it, but other, usually cheaper and better, opportunities always arose, and Sally always was pushed to the back burner. One day in October 2009, I was hanging out with my friend Nick, and we had nothing to do whatsoever. He'd tried Salvia many times before, even up to 120x, and suggested the idea of getting some. We got a friend of ours, we'll call him Joe, to go to a local head shop to get us some. I went with Joe to get it while Nick stayed at his house to make his room as trippy as possible for the trip. We only told Joe to get 20x or 40x, but he came back with 80x. I had no idea how strong it would be. I wasn't about to complain. In about 20 minutes, we got back to Nick's house. Joe left, his dad had just called him and he needed to help with some things around the house. So I went into Nick's room to find that he had set up a surround sound stereo playing Spangle. I knew from previous psychedelic experiences that Spangle is definitely a great choice in music for the occasion. Nick had his brother's bong all cleaned out and set up with a fresh screen. Everything was set up with such precision, I could tell this was going to be one of the strongest trips of my life. I packed a huge bowl, and managed to light and take the entire hit. I handed the bong to Nick since I couldn't reach a table and would hate to drop such a nice piece. Before even exhaling, the room started to swirl. The last sober vision I had was of Nick putting the bong on a table, and then reaching up to the drawstring from the ceiling fan to turn off the lights. And then, it began. It felt like my head was rotating around in a clockwise direction, as if I tilted my head to crack my neck and just kept going in a full circle. The entire room turned black, but was flashing blue as if there was a strobe light on. Nick got up, and his legs merged into one continuous tail sort of thing, kind of like the genie from the Disney movie Aladdin. He was floating around in very fluid, ghost-like motions. He leaned towards me, and began speaking a language I don't recognize, but I understood it at the time. He said something to the basic effect of "let's go." Words started to appear on the wall behind him. They looked like those neon open signs at gas stations. I can't remember what they said, but I do recall they shifted in color from red to green and then to yellow, and repeated in that pattern. By this point, Nick was floating all over the room. He still had the genie's tail, and for some reason seemed to be wearing one of those face masks one would wear to protect against airborne illnesses. I remember thinking to myself how this was one of the most awesome light shows I've ever seen, and how sweet it would be to just stay and watch it forever. Eventually, Nick was back in the chair he was sitting in when I handed him the bong. His face mask was gone and his legs were back. At the start of the trip, I was sitting on his bed, leaning against the wall, but now I was at the edge of the bed. This was strange because I don't remember moving at all. Nick asked me how it was, and I asked him how he was flying around so fluidly, and where the face mask went. He had no idea what I was talking about, and asked why I moved to the end of the bed. For about 20 minutes afterwards, my movements felt very different than normal. It's hard to describe, they were both light and easy, and hard and jerky at the same time. It was maybe another half hour before I decided to pack an even fatter bowl. This time, there was no music. Nick left the lights on. I took the hit and handed him the bong. As I exhaled, it felt like I was being pulled into the wall behind me. I tried to move forward to escape being devoured by the wall, but it was no use. The same head rotation feeling as before set in again. There were millions of voices all speaking the same language Nick spoke during my first trip. I can't remember everything they said, or what their exact words were, but they were telling me to just give up, and accept my fate. I don't even know what fate it was that they spoke of, but I decided I would accept it. I really had no other choice, did I? By this point I was inside the wall behind me. As I looked around, everything was incredibly colorful and hard to decipher. I reached out and managed to grab onto the edge of the wall, and pulled myself back out to the bed. Everything looked essentially the same as normal, except Nick had a 10-foot wide smile and gigantic cartoonesque eyes. I called to him to help me, that I didn't want to go back in the wall, but he didn't react at all. Before I knew it, I was pulled back in. This time, it was a forest. It was very dark. There were trees, and lots of lightning, but no thunder. I saw animals that I couldn't identify. There was this red being hunched over in the distance, maybe half a mile away. I looked up and saw an opening. I grabbed onto it, and was pulled back onto the bed. Now, Nick wasn't there. The room was empty except for the bed. I yelled, "Somebody, help me." But it was useless. The wall was already trying to bring me back to the forest again. This time, the setting was almost the same, except all those weird animals were running away as fast as they can. The red being in the distance was walking towards me. He was about a quarter mile away now. I thought to myself, I didn't even leave the forest for long, he has to be moving really fast. A hole opened up in the ground, and I jumped in. I fell onto the bed, except now the bed was surrounded by brick walls. I looked over at the one to the left and saw two pairs of giant cartoon eyes looking over at me. A giant hand reached out of the wall, reached up, and smacked them down before I could even ask them for help. And the brick wall behind me now took me back into the forest. This time, the red being was no more than 10 feet away from me. He was holding a person in his hand. The top half of this person's head was torn off, and blood was dripping everywhere. The person told me I tried to help, I'm sorry. And the realization came to me that the person was Nick. I looked up at the red being again, and came to the conclusion that it could be none other than Satan himself. He dropped Nick, grabbed me by the shoulders, and started saying, "Are you back? Are you okay? Say my name is Alex, and I am back." Slowly, the forest started to melt away. The lightning stopped, the trees were gone. I found myself in the swirl of colors from when I first went into the wall. A voice kept repeating what Satan was saying. The voice at first sounded like the deep, horrifying voice of Satan from the forest, but it slowly changed into Nick's voice. I wanted to say shut the fuck up. I'm fucking fine. But I couldn't find any words. After the swirling stopped, I looked at Nick and asked him, what the fuck just happened? I was shaking, and nearly to the point of tears. For a few hours after coming back, I couldn't remember any of the trip. It seemed to me like I just handed Nick the bong, and he was instantly asking if I was okay. By his account, after I handed him the bong, I started shaking as if I was having a seizure. Occasionally, I would stop shaking and start yelling and screaming in a made-up language. Hearing this, Chris, Nick's older brother, and his girlfriend, who were in the room next to us, came over at one point to see what the hell was going on, and Nick chased them out. Apparently, the cycle of shaking and yelling lasted over 20 minutes. At some point, I reached for my guitar, and Nick grabbed my shoulders to stop me from picking it up and dropping it or something, and he says I shot him a glare so hateful that it looked as if I was about to punch him square in the face. As fun as the first trip was, the second one was so frightening that I actually considered never doing any drugs again after coming back. I was scared senseless, and I didn't even remember what happened until a few hours later.